All right, just checking to be sure you can hear me. Get a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, all good. So I affirm that there should be a pedophile rights movement. First, I think it's important to define specifically what a pedophile is because there's a lot of confusion around this topic. A pedophile is someone who's sexually attracted to a prepubescent child who does not exhibit secondary sex characteristics, but not necessarily somebody who has sexually abused a child, and this is really important. According to the New York Times, description applies to about 1% of the male population. One very large misconception, though, is that all child molesters are pedophiles. In fact, this label only applies to about 1/2 of child molesters. Not only that, but people with pedophilic interests are non-offending pedophiles a vast majority of the time. In a study of 3,900 people, only 39 people reported having pedophilic interests, but only 10 of those people reported having sexual contact with children. Almost 75% were non-offending pedophiles. In fact, there's entire online communities dedicated to pedophiles who understand that their feelings are wrong and are devoted to never hurting children. Also, I think that in declaring that there should be a pedophile rights movement, proving that there should be equal protection of pedophiles where there currently is none, should be enough to justify that there should be a rights movement. So now that the stage is set, it's important to understand what pedophilia is. While originally classified as a sexual orientation, it is now understood that pedophilia or pedophilia disorder is a mental illness under the larger scope of paraphilic disorders. And we know this is a mental disorder for a few reasons. Because in studies with pedophiles, when their brain chemistry was analyzed, there was underdevelopment in the areas that identify secondary sex characteristics. And we know also that it negatively affects people's lives, which is one of the signs of mental illnesses, yet it does not receive equal treatment from other types of mental disorders. The first way this is true is with stigma. While other types of mental disorders are seen as things that should receive treatment, pedophilia is not. People are demeaned and put down for their attraction. In fact, psychologist Jesse Baring writes that people with pedophilia, quote, aren't living their lives in the closet, they're eternally hunkered down in a panic room, end quote. Not only does this not help the people with the disorder, as James Cantor finds, that these people face higher predisposition of alcohol use, anxiety, and depression because of the stigma, but it can also help stop sexual assault if they go to therapy. He continues that evidence strongly suggests that treatment can prevent the majority of these men from pursuing sexual contact or online sexual material involving children. The second way this is true is legally. So while other types of mental illness are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act and similar acts, there's a clause that specifically rules out pedophilia. So this means that even if there is an adult who would never abuse a child, yet is attracted to one, which a vast majority of people who are pedophiles are, they could risk any type of discrimination for seeking help coping with this problem, including being terminated from their job. Nobody chooses to be sexually attracted to children, just like nobody chooses to have depression or anxiety. So we should give help to those people who are in order to promote equality and offset the negative impacts.
Okay, can you hear me? Thumbs up. Cool. All right, let's get started. First, we're going to just start with a brief overview about the resolution. One, he says, defines pedophile as someone attracted to children. I want to define rights movement as something to have a change. The first thing that the affirmative has to do is they have to substitute what this change they're working towards is. Now I'll get into my case. One, according to an article published on archopeofchildren.org, today 6 children will commit suicide due to dealing with sexual childhood abuse. It is because of this statistic I negate today's resolution. There should be a pedophile rights movement. My value for this round is justice. One, pedophilia is wrong. Children are not old enough to understand leaving traumatized children. Subpoint A. Merriam-Webster defines a pedophile as a person who's attracted to prepubescent children. These are children or most of the time don't even know what sex is. According to an article from CNN, a psychiatrist in Florida did a study that said 80% of all children that were a victim of pedophilia type violence deal with depression, 75% with PTSD, 75% have suicidal thoughts. And an article from a study reported in the Christian Science Monitor said 84% of all prison inmates were sexually abused as a child. They are 59% more likely to be arrested, as a 20% more likely to commit a violent crime. 65% of people in treatment for drug abuse have been molested as a child. B, pedophilia is inherently abusive. According to arcofhopechildren.org, in 2015, a child raped by someone over 20 occurs every 2 hours. 1 in 3 girls will be sexually molested before the age of 17 by someone twice their age. 1 in 6 boys with the same scenario. C, a pedophile rights movement would continue to bring this to the forefront of victims' minds. Victims watching the news and Facebook would be reminded even more of the horrors they experience. experience. Contention 2, this brings less validity to other social movements. There are so many needed social movements happening today: same-sex marriage, gender, race. There are so many times that social movements are grouped together. An article from the Chicago Tribune stated that when interviewed about what people were marching for with the women's rights movements after Trump's election, there were over 45 different answers. If we add violent acts such as pedophilia to these marches, it lowers the validity of important movements. 3, creates a slippery slope for other social movements. If we see a ludicrous idea of social movements that bring harm to others, as proven in contention 1, what social movement rights are next? Murderers, serial killers, terrorism? Where do we draw the line? Going on to his case. 1, all he does is kind of define what a pedophile is, but he never justifies why the movement should happen. He says that they need certain rights and protection under the Disabilities Act. We're going to look to an article from the APA and the Washington Times that specifically says that it is not all pedophiles have mental disorders, but some do. So we're going to specifically see how this does happen at many different times where they do. 2, even though these happen, and he says that not all are happening, we see these acts in my contention 1 that specifically lay all of these acts that happen that are pedophile acts, older people having sex with pre-puberty children, and we see that this is an inherent problem.
All right, so thanks for that. So the first thing he says is he talks about how pedophilia is wrong. He first lays the groundwork that there must be some sort of change in the status quo for a rights movement to be necessitated. And I 100% agree with that. Now, he doesn't really argue with my definition of pedophilia, which, by the way, is in the DSM-5, right, which is the official thing that most psychologists would use to classify a mental illness. So right there, you're going to be preferring my definition, right? And then he goes on to talk about how not all pedophiles have a mental illness, right? I even talk about this, right? Most people who are offending pedophiles don't normally have pedophilia disorder. They're not attracted to children. They just want to do it for some other reason, right? Like how most of rapes don't really happen because they really want to have sex. It's because of some sort of power dynamic, right? This is still true with pedophilia as well, right? And then he talks about how pedophilia is wrong and children don't know what sex is. And I 100% agree, right? And that's why the entirety of my case, right, is structured around getting these people support for their mental illness so that they don't commit these crimes in the future, right? And I even go on to talk about how most pedophiles, right, about 75% of pedophiles understand that this is wrong and they would never do that, right? So all the impacts that he lists of how children, you know, are more likely to commit violent crimes, they're more likely to do all these things, you can 100% write those off and turn them against him, as a matter of fact, because my case solves for that, right? If we give more help to people who have pedophilia disorder, they're less likely to commit these crimes, and then you're less likely to see the impacts on his side. If you want to see those impacts, you vote for the pro. But second, let's go on to talk about how he says pedophilia. Pedophilia is inherently abusive. I already showed you that this isn't true, that there's swaths of pedophiles who know that their thoughts and feelings are wrong. They know that they're not natural and they know that they can never act on them, right? And they know that they have to live their lives by that, right? Then he says that this, his second contention is essentially that this will take away from other rights movements. And his first point is that you'll just group it in with other things, right? And he's like, when people are interviewed in the women's rights, they didn't really know what they were about, and there's 45 different answers, right? Well, that's only going to happen if people who are, promoting the pedophilia rights movement group it in with women's rights, right? If you give it the least, charitable interpretation that you possibly can of any side, right? Obviously, you're going to be able to find ways that you don't vote for it, right? But if we give it a charitable interpretation, right, that people don't campaign with these in the same places, they don't campaign and lump them together, then he has no ground for that statement, and it doesn't take away from women's rights. But then he goes on and there's like, oh, well, there's a slippery slope. When are we going to start, we might start advocating for, a murderer's rights movement or something like that, right? But these aren't mental disorders that people live with, right? Nobody, like I said at the end of my case, nobody chooses to be a pedophile. These pedophiles even understand that what they're doing is wrong, right? They literally have their brains aren't developed in the areas that will identify secondary sex characteristics of children, right? So what we should do is we should help get these people, treatment and therapy. So 1, they experience less anxiety, depression, and alcohol abuse themselves. And 2, the children are abused less. And then you get all the impacts from his side of the case of children who are sexually abused and see this at the forefront, right? You don't see this this mantra of sexual abuse like he's talking about. If at the forefront, it's a forefront of therapy and not one of just saying it's okay to rape kids, which is never anything that I argue in my case.
Okay, so we're going to get on the very top of this, and we're going to get with this whole situation. The resolution is not saying we should give therapy to pedophiles. It's saying that there should be a pedophile rights movement. So he can't capture solvency of specific help coming to these people because a social rights movement doesn't guarantee change. It's a movement towards the change, but it doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. He has no solvency that a social rights movement leads to the change for the pedophile situation. If this has been an inherent problem for so specific long, where where's this inherent barrier saying that this hasn't happened already? Like, why are we not doing this when people have talked about it? And there's all these support groups and there's all these chats and all these Facebook. Like, he has no saying as to why the social rights movement are going to capture his solvency, so that never happens. Two, he goes on to my whole like pedophilia is wrong contention, and how he argues that specific contention is basically all he says is there are some that are, there are some that aren't, but one bad apple can ruin a whole batch. Like, at the fact that we still see these problems happening and this specific scenario, and we can separate, fine, I'll give him. There are people that don't act on their pedophilia actions, but there are people that do. So there's no guaranteeing, even if these people start to do this rights movement, that the people that are acting on this action are going to take this treatment. Therefore, he has no solvency to be able to bring that around. So we're going to look at those specific arguments for that happening at the fact of it is currently happening. Even if there aren't pedophiles and that are acting like he says, then why are all my statistics true in today's age? Why are we still having this happen? There's no guarantee that these people would take this therapy. They're enjoying what they're doing. Therefore, we still have an inherently abusive problem. Two, the whole brings less validity for other social movements. He says we can't group them together and this can't happen, but it does. And again, his plan has no way to separate these things from happening. And pedophile is known in the media. It's known as people as something that is wrong. It's something that is great. So when people see another social rights movement and that starts getting the talk, because who would do a pedophile social rights movement, it brings away the validity and the things of the other situation. The two on this is look to the fact that it can even group away the situation of transgenders. Transgenders have been called pedophiles in several different situations because of their going to the same bathroom as a certain child in that situation. And when you begin to go for pedophile rights movements at the same time as the transgender rights movements, you're going to see this grouping automatically start to happen together and make it worse for those that are trying to gain rights. Three, on the slippery slope for future movements, you're going to see that it's this ludicrous idea of social movements. Again, once we see pedophile, so serial killers are known as a mental disorder. So if we start to do that for this, how do you know a serial killer or a murderer is not going to continue to come in this area? Then you go back to his case, and again, we have this definition, but we don't see the solvency of how raising a social movement will bring about this from actually happening.
All right, so let's just start at the top. So he says that you can't capture therapy under rights, and there's no guarantee that people will go to therapy, right? But prefer my interpretation that I read you in my case, right? That if there is some sort of right that we need to give to this group so that some sort of change can happen, then it necessitates a rights movement, right? This just can be an argument against any pro case on any resolution, right? He's essentially saying like, oh, well, why isn't this already happening? Why isn't this happening already? Why aren't we already doing it? Well, any pro, should resolution can have that response to it, but that doesn't necessarily make it valid, right? Prefer my interpretation, right? A mental disorder isn't protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is really important because they can face discrimination even if they have the best intentions, even though they did not choose to be sexually attracted to children, even if they want to go to therapy to try to get help so they don't abuse children in the future, they can still be fired from their jobs simply for admitting that they have that orientation. That's really, really messed up, and that can lead to all the negative effects he has on his side. Let's go into that. He said that if this is true that there's so many non-offending pedophiles, then how are my statistics even possible? Well, 1% of the male population identifies with pedophiles, whereas 75% of that 1% is non-offending, right? That's still a lot of people who offend. But if you still prefer my interpretation that these people should be allowed to go to therapy under the law, and there shouldn't be a stigma against them, which I would say definitely falls under the right, the scope of a rights movement, because it still gives them those rights in society of their peers, right? These people will lead better lives, one, but two, all the impacts he reads about kids not being, kids having higher rates of recidivism, kids having higher rates of arrest, right? All that goes away as well, because we still gain the impacts of these people going to therapy and not abusing the children in the first place. He never really answers why this shouldn't fit under the umbrella of a rights movement, because they're literally not protected under the same rights as other mental illnesses. Then he gets into this thing of, serial killers are classified as a mental illness. One, I don't think that's classified in DSM-5, and if it is, I would love for him to point that out to me. But two, even if there are people who are non-offending people who want to be serial killers, why shouldn't they be allowed to go to therapy so that they don't go out and kill people? There's still not a very good answer to this as well. If people want to change these mental illnesses they have about themselves where their brains are undeveloped, and this is negatively impacting their lives in a way that they can't control, and if they go to therapy, it can solve all these problems, why wouldn't this happen, right? And then let's go into this last thing that he talks about how this is going to be taking away from other civil rights organizations, right? And I say that, well, if you give it a really bad and a really uncharitable interpretation, then yeah, sure, you'll be able to group it into things. He says, well, it's already happening with women's rights. No, he never reads you evidence that pedophilia is getting linked in with women's rights. One, two, he's saying this happens with the transgender movement, right? But if you prefer and you vote pro and that there's less stigma about this in the public, right, then people will stop grouping it in together anyways, right? Because if there's less stigma against this, then that won't be ammunition for them to use against other civil rights movements. If you vote pro, it literally solves for all of the harms that he brings up on his side.
is less stigma argumentation, you're going to look to my subpoint C on my contention 1 that says a pedophile rights movement would actually bring this to the forefront of victims' minds. Like, this isn't stopping it from happening. All these profile victims are actually going to continue to see this on a daily basis now, and that's going to make it specifically worse. When you bring that to the basis and this begins to happen, it links with the transgender specifically at that point, and you have no solvency. Going up to the top about how we goes back to the why haven't we done this before. This can be added to all pro case. According to him, there is support groups that are available online. There are support groups that are there. I just did a Google search specifically, and on an article from the Washington Herald, it says that there are over 150 treatment centers nationwide for pedophilia. These things do exist for them to do it, whether they're sanctioned or not. The therapy and the treatment is there for them to do it. They don't reach out and actually accept it to happen. He has no solvency that that's going to happen now. 2, we go on to the fact of the job transfer, and he goes into the job situation. 1, this is non-unique because people can be fired for any reason within the status quo right now. There's no justification for that to happen in this situation. So even if there's in a right situation, in Texas, we have a fire at will policy, and you can fire for specifically anything that you want. At the point where we see that, he can't grant the solvency on this. 2, he has no proof that therapy solves for the problem. Like, the therapy actually could exist, and if we granted this to happen, it goes down to the fact that he can't prove that therapy solves pedophilia. So we can't have that to happen. 3, he totally negates the resolution of the fact, or my reputation on the fact that there's no guarantee these people are going to seek therapy. He says 1%, 75%. The 1% isn't going to see these effects that are happening if that was true. So we're going to look to the impacts and how the impacts don't add up to his statistics. And then 2, we're going to look on the fact that these people that are doing this, there's no way that they're going to reach out and actually guarantee the therapy to happen. So 2, we look to the risk of solvency at the end of this debate. We look to the fact that right now, this is happening right now. We see what's going on. We see how he gives no change. We look back to the resolution. We are not legalizing anything with his plan. Voting pro does not bring therapy to these people. It's saying that a rights movement could happen. I show you how when a rights movement happens, 1, it creates a slippery slope for other movements. And he says that serial killers, there's no link in the DSM-5. There are therapists that have specifically said that this was a mental disorder within their brain where they had to kill. These things had to happen. So if we get to these little logistics, fine, then where's their rights for the fact that they're not on the DSM-5 or where this isn't going to happen? There's the social rights slippery slope that I'm talking about that's going to happen. And this goes, when you see these start to go, you specifically link into my contention 2 about this is bringing less validity to things such as same-sex marriage, transgender, race, things that are such a big problem in this country. There's no way he links out of that because he has no solvency that 1, therapy actually works, and 2, these people are actually going to take it. And then we look to, again, the pedophile is wrong and all the impacts that come off of that, and there is no other vote in this pecan.
All right, so let's just start. So he brings up this argument again about why is this happening already. He brings up there how there's already support groups, right? I talk about why it's not already happening already. He said because these people, if they go to therapy, I understand that there's therapy options available for these people. If they go to those things, they can be fired from their job. And he says, well, that's legal. No, the Americans with Disabilities Act literally says for mental illnesses, you cannot be fired for your job on the pretense of illness. They have to provide accommodations to people with mental illnesses, as a matter of fact. But there's a clause that literally prohibits pedophilia from that, right? He says that in Texas, we have this rule that you can fire anyone for any reason. Yeah, but you can't fire them for reasons that have to do with mental illness. I'm 100% sure of this. And I would love for him to link the law after this debate so you can go in and look at that. But second, remember, like I already brought up, this is a very bad interpretation, right? This can be used against any pro argument. It's not valid, right? Why isn't this happening already? Any resolution where you're talking about any possible polity, option, this could be an argument that can be brought up. It's not unique, right? And then he specifically talks about this idea of how, so that then links back into the idea of, well, he tries to delink me on the term that I read against his argument, which is that all these, negative side effects and impacts that he reads of people who get molested as children, right? But if I can prove that like this, that people would go to therapy because now they can't be fired for literally admitting that they're somebody who needs to go to therapy for something like this, they'll take the option. As a matter of fact, the study that I literally read in case from James Cantor says that these types of therapies could definitely be beneficial to these people and could definitely curb their behavior. And this is real. And this is also, if you don't even buy the evidence, prefer the logic too. This is therapy works. This is a time tested thing that we've been doing in across the world for generations, right? If therapy doesn't work, then it undermines our entire understanding of all of psychology, right? And if he doesn't buy that argument, then you can't buy any of his arguments about how serial killers are actually classified in the DSM-5 or something like that. And then let's go on to that argument now, because he talks about how this is going to be taken away from all these other social rights movements, and this just doesn't really make any sense, right? Not only does he say not only does he not really respond to the fact that serial killers are never really classified as a mental illness, and he can't cite under what mental illness they're classified in the DSM-5, he never responds to the other argument I made. So don't let him extend this further, right? That even if there are people who are non-offending serial killers, right, that have a lust for killing, right, and they understand that that's wrong, and they want to go to therapy for that, even if that's not protected under law, it should be, so that we can get people who don't go out and become serial killers, right? He never responds to this, so don't let him run this argument about how it's going to be grouped in with all these other, civil rights organizations, right? If you give it a really bad charitable interpretation and that people, show up to women's rights rallies, preaching for pedophilia rights, right? Then maybe it'll be grouped in like that, right? But if you give it a charitable interpretation where you can separate these things. Not only that, but if you also buy my argument that I make earlier that he doesn't respond to about how if you give these people these rights, there won't be a stigma against them and there will be no need to lump them together, then there will be no problem on that. So I've turned his first point and I've blocked out his second point completely. There's really no reason to vote con at this point.
So first, I want to go back to the resolution that he keeps continuing to avoid. We are not asking for legalization. We are asking for a rights movement. You're going to go to the third subpoint C of the contention, one, that he has dropped, that this would continue to bring it to the forefront of people's mind. Victims watching this would remember what happened because pedophilia is brought to the forefront. Then we're going to go up to the very top about how we go to this whole therapy situation, and he's saying that the fire and the Texas at will situation. My one on this is just because they say they don't do it from pedophilia, they don't fire them because of that. They can fire them for other reasons. Specifically in this state, they can say that they're unable to perform the job that is required, or they're slower at the job, or they're not producing. This doesn't take away the stigma of the pedophilia. They can say, okay, fine, we hire them, and then fire them 2 days later because they are unable to perform. Like, there's no solvency to the fact that these people gain the rights, because at this point that it happens, we're still seeing them as a pedophilia in the workplace, and they can still be discriminated against, not only by the boss, but by the customers, the consumers, the situation, the pedophilia that tries to work as a custodian in a school or a teacher in a school or any of these situations can not only still be brought onto by other people, but they can be brought into that situation. So this whole argumentation of the fact that they are not going to therapy now because they might lose a job is completely out of the third wheel with no specific link. 2, the unable to perform, and 3, the stigma would still exist. You can say, I don't fire them for pedophilia, but I fire them because they came to work 2 minutes late. Like, they can come up with other reasons to fire them for the situation because it's not a good situation for the job. So that has no link. 2, you're going to go back to the brings less validity to other social rights movements. And the fact that this is happening, we're going to see the transgender argumentation that I gave totally goes untouched in his last speech, in the aspect of when you link these two together, it's going to make the transgender social rights movement look worse. And in this situation, because the stigma still exists, the social rights movement doesn't guarantee against the stigma of the situation. And then 3, the slippery slope, he says, 1, link it to the situation. 2, they could still have therapy. Again, 1, serial killers have no option to say that they're actually going to have solvency to go to the therapy. 2, there's no solvency in the aspect. I asked in the last round, where's the proof that therapy solves? No solvency in the aspect that this is going to bring about anything. But we're not coming back to a legislation. We're talking specifically about a rights movement. We're going to look at the rights movement not happening, because if you don't have the legislation of actually solving for the therapy and making the therapy happen, the rights movement doesn't bring about the change. We're not talking about the change. We're talking about a social rights movement leading to the change. So at the point where this happens, he's saying he solves because this helps the pedophiles in these situations. He has no proof that during the social movement this happens, they're not getting this therapy. 2, he says that, so again, you're going to look to 1, therapy doesn't solve. 2, there's still a stigma. 3, the solvency does not exist. And 4, this takes away from more important matters.
All right. So I think there's a very clear way that I line out my logic that he's just really not looking at. He said he's talking about how there's this legalization that we need. There's no legalization of pedophilia. I've never once argued that it's okay to molest children. I've never once argued that it should be legal. What I have argued is that it should receive equal protection under the law as other mental illnesses. And this is really, really key. So first we get into this argument about how you can be fired from your job. And he says, even if, it's protected under the law, if they find out, they can still fire you for other reasons. My first response would be, that's still highly illegal and you can bring that into a lawsuit. But even if you can't have any proof, right, the system doesn't have to be perfect. As long as they can't blatantly say they're firing you because of your mental illness, that's still a step in the right direction, and it's still a step towards a better world. His solution is to just do nothing, right? By him saying that, he essentially admits that it's a problem, but he says it's better to do nothing. What I'm saying is, at least make it so that you can take them to court and sue them for doing something wrong. That's what a pedophile rights movement would be for, right? Then he talks about how he brings up this argument time and time again about how there's going to be people who see this at the forefront, right? And they're going to see, all these cases of this rights movement, and that's really going to be harmful to them, right? But once again, he keeps thinking that I'm talking about some sort of legalization of pedophilia. You don't get these impacts if the rights movement is just centered around removing the stigma, one, and two, making it legal so that you can receive treatment and not be fired under your job, right? In nowhere has anybody ever said that this is, going to be something that will make it okay for people to rape kids, either legally or socially, right? What I'm saying is that this will actually diminish the amount of times that happens, A, which we've already proven, and B, it'll remove the stigma around that, right? Well, then he says that I don't actually provide any solvency, that therapy works. I literally say in my last speech and in my first speech that the study I cite in my first speech by James Cantor says that therapy can curb these benefits if people would just go to it. He says, well, there's no guarantee people will go to therapy. I think that if people are going to be fired from their jobs because they're going to go to therapy, but in a world where we have a rights movement that petitions and lobbies for these sort of rights for these people, in a world where those laws are going to have a better chance of getting passed, and if they ever do get passed, that's going to be a good opportunity for those people to go to therapy and get this help, right? The world doesn't have to be perfect for the rights movement, right? I don't have to prove complete solvency, but as long as I prove that we're moving in a direction that the impacts could possibly be good, that's something that you should vote for on pro ground, right? Then he talks about this entire thing about serial killers, right? And he never really gives the response, right, about how this, using the same logic that I apply here, this could definitely be something that could be good for those serial killers. Still hasn't proved to you that's classified as a mental illness. So don't let him say that this is going to get confused with all sorts of other civil rights movements, take away from their kind of political capital, because he just simply doesn't provide the link there. And then lastly, he talks about this idea that there's some sort of, people will get confused about these things. But once again, like I'm saying, that's not inherent to any sort of rights movement. He cites that people just misattributed the Women's March to different things. That still wouldn't outweigh all the benefits that I turn against him of we're decreasing child molestation and making these actual people who are born with a mental illness, their lives better.
All right. Main reason you're going to vote con today is solvency. One, we go to the legalization argument. He says, I'm not saying I'm going to legalize pedophilia. I'm never saying you're going to legalize pedophilia, but you are saying you're legalizing the rights of the pedophile to be able to get therapy. That's what you're saying. So you're still talking about a legalization. The resolution is not giving you fiat power to legalize anything. It's saying that a social rights movement should happen. Therefore, you can't grant solvency by a social rights movement because the social rights movement doesn't guarantee legalization. That's been my argumentation this entire time. You are saying there should be a social rights movement by the resolution. You are not saying that there should be a legalization of the same rights under the Mental Disorder Act for this to happen. Therefore, a social rights movement is what he has not been able to link to his solvency. Even if I grant him therapy solves, he's not been able to show how a social rights movement would lead to therapy. But we're going to get into how therapy doesn't solve. He says, one, it's still illegal to be able to discriminate that way. Two, okay, sure, it might still be illegal, but it happens still. And people don't go to court for it. People get fired because they're slow for a daily basis. People get fired or discriminated against when they walk into a room because of their sexual orientation or their color. And they don't blatantly say that's not why you're hired, but there's no actual proof to say that the discrimination doesn't happen. Two, he completely drops my reputation about the parents and the employees and the consumers and other people discriminating against them in that environment to still fear them to going to therapy for this to happen. So you're still not going to buy the solvency issue alone is why Pro loses this debate. They cannot grant solvency because all they are saying is a social rights movement. And he has not done enough work to prove that a social rights movement leads to therapy, which leads to solving. Then you look to the forefront of the mind. We have to look at the victims in this scenario. When we look to the top one, to my contention one, and all of the bad things that happen, 6 children would have committed suicide today for dealing with these kind of things. Even if he's saying not all are doing this, there's still some that are. And at the fact that you're doing this, you're almost justifying even more that, okay, these people that aren't going to take the rights, aren't going to take the therapy, aren't going to take the treatment, still should be able to be classified and looked at this scenario. He's bringing a light to a inherently wrong problem. 2, the social movements. It's going to bring to other things. You look to the transgender argument that I specifically bring up, and you look to the fact that this is linked before. Pedophilia and transgenderism has been linked. So at the point where he refuses to show how that will not get worse. We see how transgenders, same-sex marriages, race, we see that coming away from it. 45 people marching for a different reason because it was all grouped together as one. The slippery slope. Again, murder, serial killers, all of these things, they can start saying, I want rights too. I want rights too. There's no link to show that that won't happen. When I present this argument, the burden of proof falls on him, and he is not able to show that.
Just say that I show solvency in the way that if equal protection is something we want, then that justifies a rights movement in itself. And even if you don't buy all the arguments I give about the transgender movement, you prefer the impacts that I turn against him.
Talk about impacts. Let's look to contention one. That's the main impact that you're going to look at today. There is no solvency. He cannot say that a social rights movement leads to change. He says that this wants to happen. If this wants to happen, why has it not happened already? He say I can use that against any pro case. Well, he can actually turn logic against it to show, instead of just saying that it's another case. If this was something specifically that they wanted, a social rights movement would have caught on. Race has been a social movement for forever. These all have been social movements that have gone on forever, and we don't see the social movement exist. There is no solvency because he cannot guarantee therapy, and he does